Look at the minimum payment on your credit card statement. If your balance has been falling and your issuer uses a percentage A smaller required payment gives you more room this month. It can also be the reason you speed up. I wanted to answer a very specific question. Suppose you have found an extra $50 a month. Real money. Already inside your budget. You're carrying a credit card balance, paying on time, and watching it move much more slowly than you expected. Is $50 enough to matter? Yes. In the model I built, it matters a lot. But the stranger result is that the extra 50 is not always the strongest lever. On some balances, simply refusing to let your payment shrink can beat adding $50 to a minimum that keeps shrinking underneath it. That is the part of the statement I want to follow. Let me date the inputs because credit card numbers move. In the second quarter of 2026, the Federal Reserve reported an average rate of 22.15% on credit card accounts that were assessed interest. TransUnion reported average credit card debt per borrower of 6,519 lirs in the first quarter of 2026. So I am going to use around $6,500 balance at 22.15% APR. This is a model, not a copy of every issuer's agreement. Minimum payment formulas differ. For this schedule, I am using a formula that covers the month's modeled interest plus 1% of the balance, with a $35 floor later in the payoff. I am also assuming no fees, no late payments, no rate changes, and no new purchases unless I say otherwise. For readability, I am modeling monthly interest as the APR divided by 12. A real statement can differ because interest calculations depend on the issuer's method, daily balances, and the length of the billing cycle. Month 1 starts with $6,500 at 22.15%. The modeled interest for that month is about $119.98. 1% of the balance is $65. Add those together, and the modeled minimum is $184.98. You pay $184.98. The account is current. You did exactly what the statement required, but only $65 reduced the balance. Now add the extra 50. The payment becomes $234.98. In this simplified month 1 model, the interest is still $119.98. So about $115 goes toward reducing the balance. Your total payment rose by about 27%. The amount attacking principal rose by about 77%. That is why $50 can feel surprisingly powerful. It is not being compared with the whole payment. It is being added to the much smaller piece of the payment that was reducing what you owed. One legal detail is useful if a card carries balances at different APRs. Federal payment allocation rules generally require the amount paid above the minimum to go first to the highest APR balance, although special rules apply to situations such as deferred interest promotions. Our one balance model does not need that rule, but a real statement with multiple rate buckets can. If this were the whole story, the video would be easy. Pay 50 extra. Finish sooner. Save interest. But watch what happens to the number underneath that extra 50. On the minimum-only path, the payment starts at $184.98. By month 12, it is about $165.62. By month 36, about $130.12. By month 60, about $102.23. Nothing unusual happened. The formula is simply being recalculated against a smaller balance. That means each successful reduction in the balance also reduces what the formula asks from you next time. The required payment is getting easier at the same moment you would want the payoff to be accelerating. That is the hidden number in this problem. Not just the minimum payment today, but the amount of payment that quietly disappears over time. So I ran 4 schedules with the same $6,500 starting balance, the same 22.15% APR, the same minimum formula, and no new purchases. Path 1 is the default-looking path. Pay whatever minimum the formula asks for each month. The payoff takes 223 months, 18 years and 7 months. Modeled interest totals about $10,499. Total repayment is about $16,999. Path 2 is the obvious improvement. Pay the calculated minimum plus $50 every month. That finishes in 78 months, or 6 years and 6 months. Modeled interest falls to about $4,313. Total repayment falls to about $10,813. That is a huge improvement. The extra 50 removes a 145 months from the minimum-only schedule. Now Path 3. Do not add $50. Instead, take the first modeled payment, $184.98, and hold the payment at that amount every month, even after the calculated minimum falls below it. That schedule finishes in 58 months, 4 years and 10 months. Modeled interest is about $4,078. Total repayment is about $10,578. Read Path 2 and Path 3 together. Minimum plus 50, 78 months. No extra 50 in month 1, but keep the original $184.98 on payment for 58 months. In this model, holding the payment steady finishes 20 months earlier and costs about $235 less interest than adding $50 to a minimum that keeps declining. The reason is mechanical. A declining minimum gives some of your progress back to your monthly cash flow. As the balance falls, the required payment falls. Part of the benefit of owing less gets converted into a smaller payment instead of a faster payoff. A fixed payment does the opposite. The interest portion tends to fall as the balance falls, but the payment stays the same. That leaves more of each later payment available to reduce principal. The schedule starts to accelerate instead of relaxing. Same rate, same starting balance, same first payment. The difference is whether the payment follows the shrinking formula or stays fixed. Path 4 combines both levers. Hold the payment at $184.98 and add the $50 for a fixed payment of $234.98. That schedule finishes in 40 months, or 3 years and 4 months. Modeled interest is about $2,680. Total repayment is about $9,100. Against the minimum-only path, that removes more than 15 years from the model. Now I need to put a boundary around the result, because fixed beats extra 50 is not a universal rule. Change the starting balance to $3,000 while keeping the same APR and the same modeled formula. Minimum only takes about 146 months. Minimum plus 50 takes about 42 months. Holding the first minimum fixed takes about 58 months. At $3,000, the extra 50 wins. Why? Because $50 is now large relative to the required payment. On the $6,500 balance, the first minimum is about $185. On $3,000, it is only about $85. $50 is a much larger addition to that smaller payment. There is a second odd result inside that $3,000 comparison. Holding the first minimum fixed takes about 58 months at $3,000. It also takes about 58 months at $6,500. Under this particular formula, it would do the same at larger starting balances too. As long as the percentage structure stays the same and the fixed payment floor is not what determines the first payment. That sounds impossible until you look at the formula. Before the floor matters, the first modeled minimum is built from 2 pieces that are both proportional to the balance 1% of principal, plus interest that is also proportional to the balance. Double the balance, and you roughly double the first payment. Halve the balance, and you roughly halve the first payment. The starting payment to balance ratio stays the same, so the payoff clock stays almost the same. That does not mean balance size is irrelevant. A larger balance requires a much larger dollar payment to stay on that clock. It means the formula can hide an important distinction between dollars and time. So the useful lesson is not always freeze the payment or always add 50. It is this when comparing an extra payment strategy. Check what happens to the base payment underneath it. A plan called minimum plus 50 can sound like a fixed improvement. It is not fixed if the minimum keeps moving. There is another boundary that matters even more in real-life cash flow. Holding $184.98 when the statement later asks for $150 means choosing to keep sending the difference. Holding it when the statement later asks for 110 means sending roughly $75 more than required. That is not free money. It is a growing commitment relative to the minimum. And an extra 50 is still $50 that cannot cover something else that month. A payoff plan that leaves no room for a repair. Medical copay or irregular bill can create a different problem if the card becomes the emergency fund again. That is why cheapest in total and easiest to sustain are not the same question. The cleanest version of this model also assumes no new purchases on the card. That assumption matters enormously. To make the new purchase problem concrete, I reran the minimum plus 50 path with the same simplified timing convention. With no new purchases, it finished in 78 months. Add $25 of new charges each month, and the model stretches to about 114 months. The extra 50 is still helping. It is just no longer creating $50 of net progress. That is why a payment amount by itself can be a misleading victory marker. The balance can absorb a payment, interest, fees, and new purchases in the same cycle. What matters for payoff is what survives after all of them. If you send extra money while continuing to add charges, the schedule responds to the net effect. A $50 extra payment does not create $50 of progress if new spending adds part of that balance back. The card does not keep a separate scoreboard for effort. It keeps a balance. So when judging whether an extra payment strategy is working, the more useful evidence is not just the amount you sent. Watch the balance trend after interest, payments, and new charges have all had their turn. There is one more number already available on many credit card statements that helps put the minimum in context. Federal rules generally require periodic statements for covered credit card accounts to include a minimum payment warning and an estimate of how long minimum payments would take when the required conditions apply. The statement also includes an estimated monthly payment that would repay the balance in 36 months. Using the same simplified $6,500 balance and 22.15% monthly model, a level payment that amortizes the balance over 36 months is about $248.74. Compare that with our first modeled minimum of $184.98. The gap is about $63.76. That is a useful comparison because it changes what the minimum means. The minimum is the amount required under the account's formula for that cycle. The 36-month figure, when shown, is answering a different question. What level payment would move this balance toward a 3-year payoff under the disclosure assumptions? Your actual disclosure uses regulatory assumptions, so its number may not match my simplified schedule exactly. Those two numbers can sit on the same statement and point toward very different timelines. And that brings us back to the $50. On a $6,500 balance in this model, $50 absolutely matters. Minimum plus 50 cuts the payoff from 223 months to 78. But the more important discovery is underneath it. If the minimum is allowed to decline every month, part of your progress is converted into lower future payments. If you instead compare a fixed payment that fits your cash flow with the changing minimum, you can see whether that shrinking requirement is quietly extending the schedule. The number printed as minimum due deserves attention. It tells you what the account requires this month. It does not promise that following that number downward will produce the timeline you want. The amount your card asks for can fall on its own. Your payment does not have to.